Tale 1. The Parasite of Numa. Julian Vance was the undisputed golden boy of St. Jude's University's Department of Esoteric Antiquities in Boston. At 29, Julian possessed a brilliant, surgical mind and a chillingly calm demeanor that his peers often mistook for sociopathy. He was the quintessential academic climber, a man who viewed the ancient, mystical texts of the world not as spiritual guides, but as archaic codes waiting to be cracked by his superior intellect. His life was a meticulously constructed fortress of control. Julian's sanctuary was a brutalist, ultra-minimalist apartment on the 34th floor of a high-rise overlooking the Charles River. The space was devoid of warmth. It was a sterile gallery of stark white walls, chrome accents, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping, God's-eye view of the city below. To Julian, the apartment was a physical manifestation of his own mind, elevated, uncluttered, and impenetrable. But his internal world was currently cracking under the immense, crushing weight of his doctoral thesis. Julian was translating the Ignis Internus, a forgotten 16th-century Hermetic grimoire detailing the cultivation of Numa, the divine inner breath. His advisor, the venerable and deeply eccentric Dr. Alistair Thorne, had pushed him to the brink during their last meeting. Thorne's office, buried in the windowless basement of the Humanities Building, was a claustrophobic tomb of rotting leather and stale pipe tobacco, standing in sharp contrast to Julian's sterile world. "You dissect these rituals like a coroner performing an autopsy, Julian," Dr. Thorne had rasped, tapping a yellowed fingernail against Julian's mathematically perfect translation. "Your structural analysis of the Numa is flawless, but it is spiritually barren. You are a tourist looking at a photograph of an ocean, trying to describe the feeling of drowning. To understand the text, you must breathe the text. You must open your own inner temple." Thorne had paused, his pale eyes catching the dim light of his desk lamp. "But heed this warning, my boy. The Numa is not merely an energy, it is a tenant. And if you hollow yourself out without the proper wards, an empty house invites squatters." Julian had scoffed at the warning, viewing it as the melodramatic rambling of an old man who had spent too much time breathing book dust. But the academic challenge had been issued. To secure his doctorate, to secure his supremacy, Julian needed to move beyond esoteric theory. He needed to prove he could master the practice.
This arrogant challenge set Julian on a path of relentless, punishing self-experimentation. He transformed his sterile apartment into a laboratory for the soul. He began with rigorous fasting, stripping his body of comfort. He initiated extreme sensory deprivation sessions, locking himself in his pitch-black, soundproofed bathroom for hours at a time, performing the rhythmic, hyperventilating breathing exercises detailed in the Ignis Internus. He approached the mysticism with the clinical, unfeeling precision of a scientist and the frantic, obsessive devotion of a madman. He was seeking a physiological breakthrough, a tangible, measurable sign of the divine Numa flowing through his veins. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Boston in November was already a bleak, oppressive landscape, but through Julian's sleep-deprived eyes, the city became a hostile, alien environment. The freezing sleet that lashed against his floor-to-ceiling windows sounded less like weather and more like hundreds of tiny, frantic fingernails trying to scratch their way inside. The hum of his high-end refrigerator began to sound like a low, droning choir of monks. Julian's imposter syndrome, the dark, secret fear that he was just a fraud masquerading as a genius, began to bleed into his waking hours, masked only by his thickening arrogance. The first physical sign of the phenomenon was deceptively mundane, a persistent, agonizing tickle deep within his left ear canal. Stress-induced eczema, his rational mind immediately categorized it, or perhaps a localized allergic reaction to the change in weather. He handled the symptom with his usual obsessive control. He marched to the brightly lit fluorescent aisles of a 24-hour pharmacy at 3 in the morning, returning with an arsenal of cotton swabs, hydrocortisone drops, and antihistamines. He dug the swabs into his ear with a brutal, punishing force, achieving nothing but a deep, throbbing inflammation. Soon, the pristine white marble of his bathroom counter was littered with a gruesome, growing pile of cotton swabs tipped with bright red droplets of his own blood. The itch did not subside. It evolved. It began to feel less like irritation and more like movement, a slow, squirming friction against his eardrum. The second sign arrived a week later during a deep, agonizing meditation session. Julian was seated naked on his expensive Persian rug, the apartment completely silent save for the rhythmic, hissing intake of his own breath. He had pushed himself into a state of profound stillness, a sensory void so deep that the ambient noise of the Boston traffic 34 floors down had faded into a dull oceanic hum. Then the silence was shattered. The voice was microscopic, a metallic, scraping rasp that seemed to originate from the very center of his brain, yet echoed with impossible acoustic clarity just outside his left ear. "It is time to come out." Julian flinched so violently he pulled a muscle in his neck. His eyes snapped open. His minimalist living room was bathed in the cold, gray light of the overcast afternoon. He was entirely alone. "Hallucination," Julian gasped aloud, his voice trembling, betraying the icy facade he so carefully maintained. "Acute stress disorder, auditory pareidolia caused by severe sleep deprivation." He scrambled to his feet, checking his pulse. It was racing at a terrifying 140 beats per minute. He paced the length of his apartment, desperate to ground himself in science. He mentally recited the periodic table, the Latin names of cranial nerves, anything to reinforce the walls of his rationality. But the rationalizations felt hollow, paper-thin defenses against a deep, primal chill that had suddenly taken up residence in the marrow of his bones. The environment around him seemed to mock his terror. The sleek, reflective surfaces of his apartment, the dark glass of his computer monitor, the polished chrome of his kitchen island no longer felt clean and modern. They felt like dark, watchful eyes. He caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror, pale, hollow-cheeked, his left ear violently red and crusted with dried blood. He looked like a stranger. The voice returned the following night, slicing through the darkness of his bedroom. "It is suffocating in this flesh. It is time to come out." It was louder now. It was no longer a whisper, but a commanding, vibrating force that felt like a tiny rusted wire being sawed against his tympanic membrane. The psychological dissonance broke Julian. His Ivy League rationality shattered against the visceral, undeniable reality of the voice. He wasn't studying the occult anymore. He was a victim of it. He felt a sudden, frantic, animalistic desperation. The meticulous academic was gone, replaced by a terrified creature trapped in a cage of his own making. He needed to know. He had sought the ancient energies, the awakened pneuma,
Perhaps this horrific symptom was simply the chrysalis stage. Perhaps the divine fire was finally manifesting, burning away the dross of his mortal shell. On the third evening, a raging nor'easter hit Boston. The wind howled against the high-rise glass like a tortured beast, the apartment trembling slightly with the force of the gale. Julian sat cross-legged in the center of his living room, his body shivering uncontrollably, when the voice called a third time, scraping against the inside of his skull. "Let me out!" Julian took a shallow, ragged breath. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Come out, then," Julian whispered, his voice sounding distant, strained and broken. "Manifest." The sensation was immediate, and it was a masterpiece of grotesque agony. This was not the warm, transcendent flush of awakened spiritual energy he had read about in the Ignis Internus. It was a violent, tearing rupture. A burrowing, slick, squelching friction erupted deep within his ear canal, accompanied by the distinct, sickening sound of tearing cartilage. Julian screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure horror. He fell forward, his hands gripping the expensive fibers of his minimalist rug, tearing at it as his body was seized by convulsions. Blood, warm and thick, began to stream down the side of his neck, soaking the collar of his white shirt. He dragged himself toward his desk, his eyes wild and rolling. Angled on the polished black wood was a small vanity mirror he used for grooming. He pulled himself up, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps, and looked into the glass. He watched, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it stole his ability to breathe, as a thick, translucent, gray membrane began to slowly slide out from the bloody ruin of his ear. It was roughly the size of a human thumb, but every line of its twisted, pulsing form radiated an ancient, condensed malignancy. It clawed its way out of his skull. Tiny, jointed arms, ending in sharp, ebony fingernails, scraped viciously against his outer ear, tearing the skin as it leveraged itself free. With a wet, sickening plop, the entity dropped onto the pristine white surface of his desk. Julian slumped backward, unable to tear his eyes away. The creature was a nightmare of organic impossibility. It possessed a flat, smooth skull, utterly devoid of eyes or a nose. Instead, the lower half of its face was dominated by a wide, gaping maw filled with rows of jagged, needle-thin teeth that clicked and gnashed together with a rapid, mechanical ferocity. It was covered in a slick, gelatinous sheen of Julian's own blood and a sickly, luminescent green fluid that pulsed faintly with the rhythm of a stolen heartbeat. It was a homunculus, a physical, parasitic manifestation of Julian's own toxic hubris, his repressed anxiety, and his blind, arrogant meddling with forces he viewed as mere academic playthings. The creature circled once on the polished wood, leaving a slimy, bloody trail. It raised its eyeless head toward the ceiling and let out a faint mewling sound, a noise that sounded horrifyingly like a newborn baby's cry, filtered through a rusty tin can. Then, startled by the sound of thunder shaking the apartment glass, it darted with terrifying, insectoid speed into the deep shadows behind Julian's computer monitor. Julian froze. His mind, the brilliant engine that had defined his entire existence, completely blue-screened. This was not the spiritual transcendence of the pneuma. This was a literal, visceral birth of a monster. He tried to scramble backward, to run to the door, to throw himself out the window, anything to escape.
but his limbs were sudden lead, his nervous system, hijacked by the profound trauma of the psychic rupture, locked him in the horrifying grips of waking sleep paralysis. He lay on his side on the rug, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body rigid as a corpse. Only his heart continued to beat, a frantic, terrified drum in his chest.
Then came the knock on his apartment door. It was sharp, aggressive, real. Bang, bang, bang. "Julian? Hey man, it's Liam from down the hall. Your music is shaking my floorboards. Are you okay in there?" The simple, mundane sound of his neighbor's voice, an anchor to the normal, rational world he had just violently departed, sent a jolt of pure, electrifying panic through Julian's paralyzed body. Behind the monitor, the tiny creature panicked too. It scrambled frantically across the desk, its ebony nails clicking against the wood like falling raindrops. It scurried up the stark white wall, its translucent gray form shifting and pulsing, practically dissolving into the paint like a chameleon. It ran up and down the wall, clicking its needle teeth in a frenzy of survival instinct. "Julian, I'm going to call the super if you don't answer." Liam's voice was muffled but insistent. Julian, trapped in his meat prison on the floor, watched the frantic creature. He wanted to scream to Liam. He wanted to beg the neighbor to kick the door down, to save him, to crush the little gray abomination against the wall, but his jaw was locked tight. And then the ultimate psychological horror began to unfold. The frantic clicking of the creature suddenly stopped. It clung to the wall directly above Julian's desk, its eyeless face turning slowly to look down at Julian's paralyzed form. The creature stopped acting like a panicked animal. It seemed to realize something. It dropped from the wall, landing softly on the carpet just inches from Julian's face. The smell of it was overpowering, a foul stench of copper blood, ozone, and rotting earth. It leaned in close to Julian's eye, its jagged teeth parting into what could only be described as a mocking human smile. Bang, bang, bang. "Julian?" The tiny creature opened its maw, and when it spoke, it did not use the metallic scraping rasp from before. "Just a minute, Liam. I'm so sorry I fell asleep with my headphones on." Julian's mind fractured into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The voice that came out of the 3-inch monstrosity was his voice. It was Julian's exact baritone cadence, infused with his signature blend of polite annoyance and Ivy League arrogance. The creature reached out a tiny, blood-slicked hand and pressed its ebony fingernails against Julian's forehead. The transfer was instantaneous and agonizing. Julian felt a sudden, violently terrifying sensation of immense pressure, followed by a dizzying rush of vertigo. The world around him warped, stretched, and suddenly grew impossibly massive. The threads of the Persian rug beneath him suddenly looked like massive cables of colored rope. The legs of his desk towered above him like redwood trees. He tried to gasp, but his lungs were tiny. He tried to scream, but the sound that came out of his mouth was a faint, metallic, scraping rasp. He was looking up. He was looking up at himself.
Julian's human body, the body he had starved, tortured, and meticulously controlled for 29 years, suddenly gasped. The sleep paralysis broke. The human body pushed itself up from the floor with a fluid, terrifying grace that Julian had never possessed. The human body reached up, taking a tissue from the desk, and casually dabbed the blood leaking from its left ear. It checked its reflection in the vanity mirror, adjusting its jaw, practicing a charming, apologetic smile. It ran a hand through its perfectly styled hair. Down on the floor, trapped in the tiny, gelatinous, eyeless body of the parasite, the real Julian Vance clicked his needle teeth in absolute, unadulterated despair. He scurried backward, his tiny insectoid limbs carrying him into the deep, suffocating darkness beneath the sofa, driven by a new, uncontrollable instinct to hide from the light. From the shadows, Julian watched as the impostor wearing his skin walked calmly to the front door. He heard the locks click open. He heard his own voice, smooth and perfectly modulated. "Liam, my apologies. I was deeply immersed in my dissertation. You know how it is. I'll turn the ambient tracks off." "Jesus, Julian, you look terrible," Liam's voice drifted in. "Your ear is bleeding." "Just a scratched bug bite," the impostor laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that the real Julian had never once produced. "I'm perfectly fine, never better, actually. I feel incredibly alive." The door closed, the deadbolt slid shut. The impostor turned back to the room, its eyes scanning the floorboards, sweeping over the shadows beneath the sofa where Julian hid. The impostor smiled, a cold, empty expression that sent a vibration of terror through Julian's tiny parasitic form.
Epilogue. The legend of Julian Vance became a permanent fixture in the halls of St. Jude's University. When he finally submitted his dissertation on the Ignis Internus, it was hailed as a generational masterpiece. It was brilliant, profound, and utterly devoid of the rigid clinical coldness that had previously defined his work. Dr. Thorne, however, refused to endorse it. When asked why, the old advisor simply shook his head, looking pale and haunted. "The words are brilliant," Thorne had whispered to the dean, "but the man who wrote them is dead. I looked into his eyes when he handed me the manuscript. There was no soul in there, just a very clever, very ancient squatter pretending to be a boy." Julian Vance eventually graduated with top honors. He moved out of the high-rise, leaving the minimalist apartment behind to accept a prestigious fellowship in Europe. He became a celebrated author, a charismatic speaker, and a beloved figure in the esoteric community. And in that brutalist, white-walled apartment in Boston, the new tenants would occasionally complain to the building superintendent about a strange, persistent issue. Late at night, when the city traffic faded to a dull hum, they could hear a faint, metallic clicking sound coming from inside the walls. A frantic, desperate scratching, like a tiny, trapped thing trying to dig its way out of the dark. An exterminator was called, but they never found the source. They said it was just the building settling. They didn't know it was the sound of the real Julian Vance, trapped in the dark forever, screaming for a control he would never, ever regain.